Hello everybody, it's just come to my attention now that I just opened Photo Booth that I've worn this t-shirt in what I think are the last two videos I made for this class, and I think it says something important about my state of mind right now that I just don't really care, and I'm not going to change it. It is clean, by the way, and I have not been wearing this shirt continuously for the past week or so. So I just want to be clear about that. So hope everybody's doing well. This is my last video missive to you all. And I don't want to get all maudlin, but I do want to say that I really have missed meeting with you guys. And when I think about those of you that with whom I will never share a classroom again, that makes me genuinely wistful. So I did very much enjoy our semester together, especially the part where we were together. But I do appreciate very much the fact that all of you continue to really put in a lot of effort, and your discussion questions have been good, and no one is phoning it in. So I do appreciate that very much. Okay, so Catherine of Siena, our very last writer. As I often do, I'll start by saying a little something about her reception. In terms of Catherine's status in the Roman Catholic Church today, it literally could not be higher. I mean, I suppose if they dug her up and made her Pope posthumously, that would be an additional honor. But she is truly one of the most lauded figures in church history, and not just in a kind of informal way, but in a highly formal way. So she was canonized, roughly 100 years after her death, made a saint. But then in 1970, she and Teresa of Avila, who was a 16th century mystic, they were both given the title doctor of the church, doctor in the sense of teacher, authoritative teacher. There's only a few dozen recognized doctors of the church, and there are only 4 female doctors of the church. So this puts Catherine in pretty elite company indeed. Now, somebody asked, I may not be able to remember who asked this in their discussion question, but somebody sort of wondered if perhaps, Catherine, she's a bit much. She's a little extra. And so one of you wondered whether, she was embraced by everybody at the time. Certainly not. Somebody like her, especially a very strong female figure at the time, there were skeptics, but she always had friends in very high places and low places too, but was friends with multiple popes and all that. So, you shouldn't have the impression that everyone has always had unalloyed admiration for Catherine. It's not the case, but the fact of the matter is that she has received the highest plaudits that the church has to offer. All right. Well, first thing I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about the dialogue and then the letter. And as always, I'll try to address some of your questions. Your questions this time around were very good, but kind of all over the place. So I'll only be able to address a handful probably of those actual questions. So the dialogue is her great magnum opus. We have a bunch of her letters. I mean, I think we have something like 400 of her letters and a number of prayers. So the dialogue is not all we have, but it is her mystical masterwork. The name suggests, the dialogue suggests that what we're dealing with is a kind of back and forth conversation between Catherine and God. That's a little misleading. God is doing almost all the talking in the dialogue, and indeed in our excerpt, that is God the Father, who is doing all the talking. All right. Well, like Bernard and Bonaventure, Catherine is kind of a classic case of a mystic with an itinerary. You don't always get that. With somebody like Mechthild or Meister Eckhart, you don't have this same kind of uh, gradual, sequential plan. But you do have that to a certain extent with important qualifications with Catherine. And as with Bernard, um, she sort of talks about stages of the love of God, moving from sort of an immature love of God to a fully mature love of God. Now, sometimes she kind of talks about sometimes she uses a kind of threefold schema, sometimes a fourfold schema. The first two stages of love, if we're going to go with the fourfold schema here, the first two stages are not discussed in our reading. So briefly, the first is um, love, a love of God, but a love that is really more servile fear than anything else. This is when the person gives up sin, mainly out of fear for hell. So not a bad starting point, but not where you want to stop. The second stage of love is what she calls mercenary love. Mercenary in the sense of reward. So we love God because God rewards us. God rewards us by giving us spiritual pleasures, spiritual consolations. Again, those pleasures and consolations serve their purpose for a time, but you don't want to abide there forever. Okay, you want to make it to the third and fourth stages of love. And as it turns out, the third and fourth stages are not really sequential. They are two sides of the same coin. So the third stage of love is, leaving, what she calls leaving your house and beginning to engage in active neighbor love as an expression of one's love for God. And at this point, one is willing to give up one's own spiritual consolations for the sake of one's neighbor. Okay. And then the final stage is the stage of perfect union. Okay. And it can take place, or it can at least begin to take place, while the soul is still in the mortal body. Now, several of you had questions about the nature of union. Union language is pretty ubiquitous in mystical literature, but it's not necessarily a given. Certainly there in Catherine. But anytime you start, reading about union, you have to say, okay, well, what kind of union are we talking about, right? There's union, and then there's union. There's the union that Bernard describes. There's the union that Meister Eckhart describes. And I think that pretty clearly Catherine is much more in the Bernard camp, because the union she describes is a union of love. She writes, not in our reading, but elsewhere, we always become one with the object of our love. Love is inherently unitive. Love unites the lover and the beloved. Of course, love is a function of the will, right? And that's the kind of union that Bernard described, union of will. And anytime you have, as I said, a lover and a beloved, you have distinction, right? So union in distinction. We saw it in Bernard. We have it again here in Catherine. And the basis of union is not the pre-existence of the soul in God. We saw that with Eckhart, right? Rather, for Catherine, the basis of union, what makes union possible, is the incarnation. She says on page 277, she talks about, staring into God as if God were a deep sea. And it says, for when I look into this mirror, the mirror of the water, this is first full paragraph on 277, holding it in the hand of love, it shows me myself as your creation in you and you in me through the union you have brought about of the Godhead with our humanity. And I'm quite confident that is a reference to the incarnation of Christ, right? When God became human. So, yes, there's this sense of interpenetration, right? That God is in us. We are in God. We're not two sort of discrete entities standing opposite each other. However, the distinction always remains. So we are not in Eckhartian territory. It's not that Catherine doesn't believe in some sort of pre-existence of the soul in God. Patrick asked a question about that. She does, but it's not her starting point for her understanding of what union with God is. Her starting point for understanding union is the union of divinity and humanity in Christ. And of course, in the good Chalcedonian understanding, divinity, the union of divinity and humanity doesn't compromise either nature, right? The divinity remains divinity, human nature remains human nature, and in the same way, the soul remains the soul, God remains God, and yet there is a true and meaningful unity there as well. All right, and so those last two stages, as I said, are just sort of inextricably linked together, right? So it's not as if when one achieves perfect union with God, this perfect love of God, then one no longer needs to love the neighbor or express one's love for the neighbor. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. Now, several of you did ask questions that kind of clustered around what is kind of disquieting when you read Catherine. And that is, her views on suffering, and particularly the suffering of the physical body. Kirk asked, I thought, a very good question about asceticism. It seems that perhaps her spirituality assumes or presupposes a kind of ascetic regimen. And I think that's absolutely right. She was a quasi-monastic figure. She was what was known as a Dominican tertiary. She belonged to a Dominican third order, which means that she wasn't sort of officially a Dominican nun, but she belonged to a community of women who had in some way formally affiliated with the Dominican order. Okay, so she did have that particular affiliation. Long before that, however, she had vowed virginity as a young girl and seems to have kept that pledge. One thing that doesn't really come through in this reading is that we know that particularly early in her life, she underwent a really strict and severe fasting regimen. And sometimes, scholars today talk about the phenomenon of holy anorexia in certain medieval Christian women, medieval nuns. And Catherine, at least the younger Catherine, may well be in that camp. And that severe fasting may indeed have something to do with her premature death. Although later in life, she did write in some of her letters, she warned against extreme asceticism, perhaps having learned the hard way about that. But I think maybe the bigger question that several of you got at is, is this: is Catherine advocating some form of self-hatred in the dialogue? She talks a lot about shunning consolation. She talks about things like holy hatred. And of course, that raises the question, okay, well, hatred of what exactly?
I think a superficial reading of Catherine might suggest that it's just self-hatred that she's talking about. But if you read carefully, she's clear that this holy hatred is much more targeted. It is not simply self-hatred, but rather hatred of all one's, what she calls selfish sensuality. This um, uh, love of pleasure, and not just sort of corporeal pleasure, but spiritual pleasures as well, those sort of consolations. Um, so that's one important thing to keep in mind. Another important thing to keep in mind is that it's clear what the motivation. She talks about wanting to suffer and longing to suffer, so that's indisputable. But the question is why? For what purpose? Is it to punish herself? Is that what this desire for suffering is all about? Well, maybe. You can always psychoanalyze from 700 years away. But what she tells us is that she wants to suffer for the glory and praise of God's name and for the service of neighbor. And I should point out that, especially during these times, that she was somebody who would regularly sort of minister to plague victims. So again, I'm happy to admit that Catherine was emotionally and psychologically a complicated figure. But this desire for suffering, I don't think, can simply be chalked up to self-hatred. Now, when we come sort of even more specifically to her view of the body, I think several things need to be said about that as well. Ellie asked a good question, listed several quotes from our reading, and the quotes don't always quite seem to cohere. So what do we take away about her view of the human body, of flesh? At times, certainly, she does seem to regard the body as an impediment, but many of her remarks along those lines seem to be, riffing on some of Paul's statements in his letters about, wishing to be with Christ and wishing to be away from the body and that sort of thing. So this is, in some ways, we could see some of this language as kind of stock, Pauline biblical language. But I think what I want to focus on is the sheer bloodiness of her language and her theology. She has sometimes been called the apostle of the blood of Christ, which I think is a pretty fitting title. I don't think any of you would probably or disagree on the basis of our reading. Now, blood of Christ, yes, but she's also very interested in other blood as well, as we will see in due course. Now, one of the tricky things about all this blood language is that, yes, indeed, sometimes blood for her is a metaphor, right? She's not always referring to literal blood. So if you look at page 275, second to last full paragraph, let that fire of divine charity, let that fire burst the seed of my body and bring forth blood. Okay. Now, can't be certain, but I think that's a place where the blood is metaphorical. But what's tricky with Catherine is that blood is never a mere metaphor, any more than Christ's own blood was a mere metaphor. Now, it's true that what gives Christ's blood its value is, well, Christ's divinity, but the fact that it was shed out of love. Okay, so it's not just any old blood that's significant, right? It's blood that is shed out of love, and so for Catherine, carnality, bodiliness, is clearly not, I should say carnality as such, is not the problem to be overcome. The problem is not that, we carry around this, these gross carcasses, and won't it be great when we sort of leave those behind and we can just be pure spirits? No, in fact, I think for many of us sort of modern and postmodern folks, the problem with Catherine, the reason why Catherine might give us the heebie-jeebies, is precisely her carnality, her obsession with the body, and with blood in particular. But blood can kind of be seen as a sort of synecdoche of the body. Now, so I still, of course, her attitude toward the body is complicated. It is not unambiguously positive, nor is it unambiguously negative. It's somewhere in between. But that's really the only point I want to make, is that her relationship with bodiliness in general and her own body is highly complex. Well, speaking of blood, let's move on to the letter, which is quite amazing. Letter 9 from 1375. She's addressed this to Raymond of Capua. I want to point that out because Raymond of Capua was a Dominican friar who served as her spiritual director. So a really, really important central figure in Catherine's own life. Now, of course, the letter is not about Raymond. It's about another man. It's about Niccolo de Toldi, this Italian man who had spoken out against the Sienese government and paid for it. Catherine fosters, in a very short period of time, it would seem, a highly ambivalent and complicated relationship with Niccolo, a relationship in which Catherine serves as a kind of proxy for God, so that Niccolo's love for Catherine is in some ways channeled and funneled into God, even though Niccolo himself may not be fully cognizant of that. So we see her serving as a kind of chaplain to Niccolo. I don't think there's a better word for it. One of the things that's most stunning about this letter, apart from the image of Catherine holding this severed head in her hand, is the vision she has as she's holding this head in her hands. This vision of the God-man, vision of Christ. She's a visionary mystic. So this is not terribly unusual for Catherine. And remember, this is the late Middle Ages. This is the age of visionary mysticism. But this is again a very Catherinian kind of vision, because it involves a lot of blood. So she sees Christ with his open wound, and sees Niccolo sort of enter into the open wound of Christ, so that there's this kind of intermingling between Niccolo's blood and the blood of Christ. And this is salvific for Niccolo, right? Because now his blood has been imbued with the merit, the worthiness of the blood of the God-man. And then there's this sort of moment right before he fully enters into Christ's wound. He looks back like a bride on the bridegroom's threshold. And this is very consistent, not only with sort of, bridal mysticism as we've studied it in this class, but consistent with early Christian descriptions of martyrdom, in which the day of martyrdom is described as the day of a kind of wedding. Okay? And then, of course, we get Catherine's own reaction. I mean, we all can't help but imagine how we might be reacting at that moment. She tells us, my soul was serenely at peace and so impregnated with the scent of blood, that I could not bear to remove the blood that had splashed onto me. So again, we have to like imagine this young woman um, walking around the city for the rest of the day or longer, just um, spackled with blood that she can't bear to wash off. Um, the Middle Ages are really metal, as in heavy metal. And, whatever you think about it, it's not boring. Now, I'm not here. My job is not to assuage your delicate modern sensibilities and try to make Catherine and this letter sort of acceptable and respectable. But I do think it's important to try to remember her own historical context. She was born in the year 1347, the year that the Black Death began to sort of spread across Europe, starting in southern Europe. And, the Black Death had sort of these aftershocks, second waves, and sadly, this is all too familiar now, but so what this meant was that even though Catherine herself, of course, probably did not remember the Black Death, she lived through these second, third, fourth waves. And as I said before, she actually sort of got involved and personally tended to plague victims. So she lived in a time when death was a fact of life. Death was not something that happened behind closed doors or behind medical curtains. Death was simply a fact of life. And, either death is meaningful or it's meaningless. I'm just not convinced there's any real middle ground there. And so if you're not prepared to accept that death, especially, on the scale of the Black Death, if you're not prepared to accept that death is meaningless, you have to make meaning out of it or discover its meaning. And I think that's part of what's going on with Catherine. And of course, it's also true, apart from the whole historical context business, it's also true that the central image of the Christian faith is a naked man who had been terribly scourged and tortured, hanging on an instrument of torture, bleeding, dying, asphyxiating. So, if you're squeamish about blood and suffering, particularly in a very public kind of setting, Christianity is probably not the religion for you. But again, for Catherine, it's Christ's death that helps us understand how death can be meaningful. Perhaps it's not always meaningful, but it can be insofar as it becomes a kind of participation in Christ's suffering. Death can be an expression of love in the same way that Christ's death was an expression of love. And so you end up with this this kind of spirituality that is highly emotionally complex. There's that section that we read in the dialogue where she talks about Christ being happy and sad at the same time, and those who are united with Christ are happy and sad at the same time. There's this real sort of ambivalence there, and so she's another in a line of mystics that includes Bernard that are very skeptical of warm and fuzzy mysticism. If your mysticism is all warm and fuzzy, something has gone awry. Well, let me just make two concluding thoughts about Catherine and the mystical life, based primarily on letter 9. One thing I think we see, we see this in both parts of the reading. She is dealing with a question that has engaged so many of the writers that we've read, and that is, what is the relationship between the active and the contemplative life? Um, are they sequential? You know, you do sort of do one before you do the other. Is one superior to the other? Are they mutually exclusive? We've seen a number of answers to that. And it seems to me that she answers this pretty definitively in letter 9, especially. You know, here she is holding a decapitated head in her hand, and at that precise moment, she has a vision of Christ. Okay, so it doesn't get much more active than, you know, standing by and in a weird way participating in an execution, and it doesn't get much more contemplative than having a vision of, you know, the God man. And so this strongly suggests that for her, the goal of the mystical life, the goal of the Christian life, is this kind of fusion of the active and the contemplative. They are, not only are they not mutually exclusive, but in a way you can't really have one without the other. And I think she gets at this in the dialogue too on page 271, where she talks about leaving the house of self-knowledge, which I think kind of stands in for contemplation. So you leave the house of self-knowledge to go serve your neighbors, right, the active life. But paradoxically and mysteriously, even as you leave the house of self-knowledge, you remain there. You abide there. You bilocate in some way. And this brings me to my last point, which is a question I think that would be beneficially put to any of the mystics that we read. And it's this simple question: for whom does the mystic exist? I think in sort of the conventional wisdom, the mystic is the solitary who is communing with God and scoring these sort of extraordinary spiritual highs primarily for their own benefit. Catherine, in contrast, suggests that the whole point of the mystical life, the whole point of the mystic, is in fact service. Right? What even makes someone a mystic? Well, think about the word itself. It's related to the word mystery. So we could say that a mystic is someone to whom a mystery has been revealed. And by mystery, I don't mean something that is sort of brand new, some novelty that's never occurred to anybody, but more mystery in the sense of a deeper penetration into the meaning of Christian doctrine. And so a mystic is someone to whom a mystery is disclosed, but a mystery that doesn't pertain necessarily to the mystic as an individual, but a mystery of universal import, a mystery that is relevant to the entire human race, to all human beings. Okay? And I think we see this understanding in Catherine herself. Catherine was something of an evangelist. Catherine would sort of travel around Europe and sort of stage these revivals where she would speak and, for lack of a better word, preach. So, you know, she's an evangelist. We've already seen her in her role as chaplain. So for her, the mystical life is part of the apostolic life, being sent out into the world by Christ. So her mystical contemplations and visions were not these sort of private spiritual pleasures and disclosures, but they were the commencement of her apostolic ministry. Again, remember what we said before, what she said before. There is no love of God without love of neighbor. And so what the mystic does is share the mystery with others out of love. And I think I can do no better than to conclude with a quote, conclude this lecture and also conclude the semester in a way, with a quotation from the dialogue, but not in our assigned reading. And she's describing herself in the third person here. So she began searching, trying to see if she could find any means by which she could show her love for God. Then she saw that God supremely loved his human creatures, and that the love she had discovered in herself she found in everyone as well, because all of us are loved by God. This, she found, was the means by which she could be useful, and which would show whether or not she loved God. Then she arose, ablaze with charity for her neighbors, and she conceived such love for their salvation that she would willingly have given her life for their salvation. The service she could not do for God, she wanted to do for her neighbor. Take care, y'all.